we're going to go to the other side of the world, okay? And what happens, we're going to look at Southeast Asia, and this area here, it's, I can't see it because of my stupid thing here, but basically all this area here that includes what we today call North and South Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, were French Southeast Asia, or Indochina, French Indochina, right? And it was ruled essentially as a colonial holding of the French until World War II. All right, and in World War II, what happened was that close to the end of the war, well, actually, the Japanese invaded Southeast Asia at the beginning of the war, but they allowed the French Vichy regime, the regime that was a puppet to Hitler, they allowed them to continue to rule Vietnam until about a year before the end of the war. At which point, then the Japanese ousted the French, okay, and established their own control over all of this area, including North and South Vietnam, okay? When the war was over, the Japanese were evicted essentially from Vietnam, from this whole area, which left a power vacuum because the Japanese were evicted, but the French weren't allowed to return until sometime later. And the result was that there was a movement in Vietnam led by a guy named Ho Chi Minh, and he formed a group called the Viet Minh. And the Viet Minh were a nationalist movement in Vietnam. Okay, so now just to talk a little bit about Ho Chi Minh, he was in France at the time of the Versailles Conference, and like a number of other people from colonized areas of the world, he was very excited about Wilson's idea of national self-determination. You'll recall that one of the 14 points was that every country should be allowed to choose for itself how it was going to be governed, as long as it was democracy, right? But he became disappointed because he wrote a letter to Wilson and actually went out and rented a suit and tried to meet Wilson. The letter was never got to Wilson, and he never was able to meet with him. And the outcome of the Treaty of Versailles was to reinforce colonialism rather than to do away with it, as we've already mentioned. And the result of that then was that Ho Chi Minh, decided to go to Moscow to join a group called the Comintern. That's Comintern, Comintern, and it means Communist International, right? The Communist International was a branch of the Soviet government that was set up to export communism, right? And after World War II, this Communist International was active in many places in the world, including Southeast Asia, with the idea of supporting local independence movements against the colonial powers, right? But when they did support them, they were supporting them with the idea that they were going to establish communist states, going along with the idea, the Marxist idea that communism can't work anywhere until it actually works everywhere, right? Okay, so it's very much like what happened in Cuba with Castro, where Ho Chi Minh is nominally a communist, and he's receiving support from both Russia and China, but his writings show us that he was more of a nationalist than he was a communist, right? So at any rate, Ho Chi Minh and his group, the Viet Minh, step into the void that was created by the withdrawal of the Japanese forces and declares a republic in Vietnam. And this republic then is actually inclusive of all of Vietnam. All right. And when he does that, as basically the Declaration of Independence of Vietnam was based on the American Declaration of Independence. And when the Vietnamese declared independence, they actually appealed to the President of the United States. I'm not going to read this now, but you should know it's there, right? You can go look at it, right? Appealed to President Truman to support their movement towards independence, because he compared it to the American movement towards independence from British colonialism. You guys follow what I'm saying here? Okay, so the problem is going to be this. Because Ho Chi Minh has been active in the Comintern, and everybody knows that, how is Truman going to respond to him? He's an enemy because he's a communist, right? Anywhere we see communism, we see an enemy, right? So even though we can argue that Ho Chi Minh intended to establish some kind of a government independent of the communist bloc in Vietnam, the United States wouldn't refuse to recognize it. And as a result of that, then the United States then supports French colonialism, okay? The return of French colonialism. The French return, they try to reestablish their control over this entire area. They're not able to do it because of the kind of guerrilla warfare that's being waged by Ho Chi Minh. So what ends up happening is that the forces of Ho Chi Minh are going to be predominant in the north, and the French colonial forces will be predominant in the south, and there will be a kind of a puppet government. There was an emperor, the Emperor Bao Dai, who actually wasn't in Vietnam. He was in France, right? But he was in theory the ruler of Vietnam. And then there was a president, Ngo Dinh Diem, who was a puppet of the kind of colonialist government, the French colonial government. The problem with Ngo Dinh Diem was that nobody liked him. The people didn't like him. He was, in fact, he was a kind of a brutal guy. He ended up killing or excluding everybody that didn't follow him, agree with him. And there were a lot of different independence movement groups in Vietnam that were not communist, right? That were not communist. But Diem alienated them all. And so Diem was never able to fully establish control over the South. And Ho Chi Minh had full control over the North. Okay, so what happens then is that this guerrilla warfare goes on for some period of time. The French are able to convince the Americans that the conflict in Vietnam is similar to the conflict in Korea. And because the United States was fighting an anti-communist war in Korea, then the United States was willing and open to providing support for the French in Vietnam, with the idea being that we're going to stop the spread of communism. Remember the Truman Doctrine. We're going to stop the spread of communism, right? Okay, so in reality, they were not the same they weren't driven by the same ideas or the same actors. But from the American point of view, this crusade against communism was almost a holy cause. And one of the things that, well, I should say it this way: if we go back to the 1950s, if you asked an American what was Saigon, they would tell you it was something to eat, right? Right? They knew so little about Southeast Asia that they didn't even know that there was a city in Asia called Saigon, right? Um, but when they found out that the Americans were opposing communism there, then Americans were 100% for it. Okay, we need to keep that in mind. Americans were very much on board with the idea of American support for the French in Vietnam. And what happens is that as the war drags on, the French people are going to become weary of this anti-colonial war. All right, in Vietnam, the war was not a war between democracy and communism. It was a war between the colonialists and the anti-colonialists, right? And the French people were basically engaged in trying to defend their empire in other places in the world as well, including Algeria, where there's a big war going on there. And the French people start to question whether or not they should even be involved in this. And so the French lose their enthusiasm for fighting and reestablishing their colonial control over Vietnam. But the Americans keep supplying things and keep encouraging them to continue the fight, because from the American point of view, it's this bigger fight against communism. It's just not a matter of colonialism. So what we really see end up happening is that the United States, rather than being a beacon of independence, becomes the empire supporting the colonialists. You follow what I'm saying here? Okay, so what happens then is that the Americans keep encouraging the French, and the French keep saying, no, we don't want to have any more to do with this. And eventually what ends up happening is that there was a big battle in a place called Dien Bien Phu, which is here. And the Vietnamese roundly defeat the French and their army at Dien Bien Phu. And then shortly after that, there are peace talks in Geneva, and the French and the Vietnamese agree to an end to the war. Okay, and the end of the war, basically the outcome is going to be that the French are going to withdraw. They're going to divide Vietnam into two. Oh, shoot, wrong. They're going to divide Vietnam into two. The North will be ruled by Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh. The South will be ruled by Ngo Dinh Diem and his followers. And that in 1956, this is 1954, right? In 1956, there will be elections, and whoever wins the elections will rule all of Vietnam. Okay, so the election essentially would be between Ho Chi Minh and Ngo Dinh Diem. Okay, you guys are with me? Questions, comments? Okay, well, here's the problem. The problem is that Ho Chi Minh is very popular throughout Vietnam. He's kind of seen as the George Washington of Vietnam. And if he is a communist, he really downplays it, right? He'll say, yeah, well, we're going to be communists, but maybe not for 100 years. It might take us 100 years to get there, right? And so people in the South are not afraid of Ho Chi Minh because they don't see communism the same way Americans see communism, right? And so the reality is that if they actually did hold elections in 1956, that Ho Chi Minh would win. And so the United States saw that as a real danger. And what ends up happening is that the United States convinces Ngo Dinh Diem to stop the elections.